With the Coffee League, and I'm here today with my guest Adam Bordow. And here at the Coffee League, we interview all kinds of folks from the coffee industry, baristas, roasters, farmers, sourcers, you name it. But also very important are consumers, people that have a love for coffee, and love to hear their opinions and reflections on coffee. And Adam is grew up in Iowa and is living in San Francisco. And I know him to be somebody that has a great taste for coffee and a great love of coffee. And thanks for taking the time to talk to me today, Adam.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to join you. Thanks.
Now, can you remember when you started drinking coffee and what lured you into that world?
Gosh, well, my first stint with coffee was Starbucks in college, and it was all I knew was the giant venti frappuccino to get me through exams. So, loaded with whipped cream and sugar, and that was my first impression of what coffee was, which was actually mostly milk at the time and very little coffee itself. And then I think when I first really got into coffee was when I was living in San Francisco, when I moved to San Francisco in 2013. And I went to this shop called Four Barrel, which is on a main street called Valencia. And I really didn't know anything about coffee at the time. I knew that there was espresso, which I pronounced espresso, and I knew that there was coffee, which was just drip coffee. I didn't know the apparatuses. I didn't know beans. I didn't know sourcing. I didn't know anything. It didn't really matter to me. But there was this one man by the name of Bradley who still works there, and he had a set of two pour-over machines. I think they're beehives. And above it was a big sign in wooden kind of like patina lettering called the slow bar. And I was always curious as to what the slow bar was. And there was 5 different jars of beans, and it was basically his curation of all the beans that Four Barrel sourced from different regions in Africa and Guatemala and Nicaragua. And I was always curious to try it, and I was always curious as to what the slow bar was, but I never had the guts. And I was also quite intimidated to go over there and talk to him. But once I did, it kind of opened up a whole new world as to what goes into creating your single cup of coffee and all the different processes and all the different people along the way that have touch points in terms of bringing you that cup. And what really amazed me was his precision in making, such a scientifically, exact and perfectly balanced cup of coffee, but also how he described the flavors. And before, I wouldn't know the difference between a French roast and Italian roast or anything of his, was sitting right in front of my nose. But the way he described things was poetic. And it was like, I said, well, what is the difference between this Kenyan bean and this Nicaraguan bean? And he said, well, how are you feeling today? Are you feeling cozy, or do you want to feel like you're sitting by a fire, or, listening to cello, or do you want to feel like you're up and ready, and do you want to get work done? And he described them in terms of prose and poetry that I'd never heard before. And I was like, wow, there's really a subculture that's dedicated to this perfection. So I started to get into it, and then I bought, a grinder, I bought a scale, I bought a Chemex, and I started to become a self-proclaimed enthusiast by measuring out beans, things that were very rudimentary to making a good cup of coffee, but they became really important to me. And then I started to learn how to pull an espresso shot and how to weigh, out your beans. And it became a love affair with discerning different flavors of coffee and different experiences that matched the mood of the day or that matched the mood within me. And every cup was different, and that's what was so magical.
And did
but
you?
It was awesome.
So you found that knowledge of the product of what you were consuming had an influence on your appreciation of it. Just like people drink wine, and the more they know about it, it seems the more they enjoy it. It's the same thing with coffee, I know. And
Yeah.
they do what's called cupping, where It's a way of
Yeah.
tasting and finding the subtleties of the taste. It's something I hope
Yeah.
to learn. And but it's amazing. So when you got that information, you went to Four Barrel to the Slow Bar.
Yeah.
I'm going to assume you went back a number of times and spoke to him. And then when you started making it at home, did you stop going
Yeah.
to cafes or did you do both?
I did both. I'd always have a cup in the afternoon, or if I was, at work, I would make a cup, at the company I was working for. But, um, I think really what transformed it was my pursuit of wanting to discern the different flavors from these different regions and to be able to identify, the lemon zest of a Kenyan
Hmm.
versus the orange zest of an Ethiopian.
Hmm.
So it was just this pursuit of perfection, which seems so much more infinitely complex than even wine, or so I've been
Right,
told, in
right,
terms of the chemical makeup and how many flavors that can actually result in.
right. And what do you like
So
now? Do you usually go with single origin, and do you drink your coffee black? And if so, what are some of your favorite beans, and where are they from?
yeah, so I think I got into the snobbery of it for a while, so
Uh-huh.
uh, which I've kind of gotten out of. And I like single origin just because it's one single element to
Hmm.
focus your palate on. I think my favorite beans that I've ever had were from the Coffee Collective in Copenhagen.
Hmm.
Um, Something just magical, and I can't even describe about them. I love Intelligentsia beans. I still love Four Barrel. I think those three roasters are really have integrity behind their sourcing,
Hmm.
and behind their distribution and their appreciation for where the coffee comes from, and also a respect for the growers and farmers who make the beans.
Hmm. Tell us
So
about your experience. We've discussed this before off the air about coffee collectors in Copenhagen, and I've been there as well. I had the good fortune my wife is from Sweden, so I spent a lot of time in Scandinavia the last few years.
hmm
And this past summer,
hmm
I spent time in Copenhagen, and I try to get to every cafe that was recommended, probably 20 or 30 of them. But Coffee Collectors is a very special place, and it's right across from a cemetery. The area is beautiful, and if you're in, I think they have a few locations in Copenhagen, but that there is a main location, and it's consistent and always fantastic. But tell us your experience there and what it was you liked
yeah.
about them.
Well, the first cafe I went to was across from the cemetery gardens that you mentioned. It actually looked like it was I was walking into someone's kitchen. So you just walk in and there's just one barista in front of what looks like a household kitchen.
Hmm.
And I didn't even know if I was in the right place. But they made the best cappuccino I've ever had in my life, and the milk quality was just out of this world, incredibly smooth and luscious, and like nothing I had had before. And then there's another location I went to, I think in I can't remember the name, but further west of that, north southwest. And it was more looked like a sit down restaurant. And I came up to the counter, and he had a selection of actually of cuppings that were already out, and had me try each one, and then asked what I liked and how I wanted to feel that day, and similar to what they do at Four Barrel, but much more intricate and much more hospitable. It's just a totally different experience. And you can actually sit down, and they'll serve you cups of coffee there as well. So it's almost like a restaurant for coffee at that location. And there's one that's within a big marketplace of food vendors that's more of kind of on the go, service, but still serves the same beans. But I just found like they were scientists, and they wanted it's a complete pursuit of perfection. I think they, above any other roaster in the world, maybe except for Tim Wendeblow's his place in Oslo, they've done it. And so, yeah, that was my experience in
Right.
Copenhagen.
I wanted to.
Are you there? Hello.
Are you hearing me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, little technical issue there, but we're past that. And one of the, I was mentioning that I think at that cemetery It's where Hans Christian Andersen is buried.
Yeah.
And if you go to Copenhagen, contact me here at the Coffee League, and I'll make some recommendations for you, or if you're going anywhere for that matter. And one of the people that I interviewed, it's posted up, is Omar Magard Hussein. He grew up in Copenhagen. He became the head barista at the Coffee Collector and Coffee Collective, I think it's called. And he was training them there. Now he is in the head roaster for Brownville Roasters in New York City, and he has a cafe that he runs in Grand Central Station at the Nordic Center there. So a fabulous barista, tremendous experience coming out of there, and as you mentioned, Adam, a wonderful place. You also mentioned another place I went to that is really a place that all coffee lovers should make a pilgrimage to if they have the opportunity to do so, and that is Tim Windelbo's cafe in Oslo, Norway. Tell us about your experience there.
Yeah, so I was in Oslo for only a couple days, and I actually stayed around the corner from Tim's shop. And I heard of the lore of this place, and I heard of his his prestige within the coffee world. And I went in, and you walk in, and there's a door to the left, and it almost looks like a laboratory. And Tim was there working in all white, and it almost looked like he was a chemist, concocting his next batch of beans. And up front is a beautiful wood countertop with usually one barista, and a very almost like a fine dining like menu that you order from. And it's an experience that makes you feel and appreciate coffee no matter where you are at with your knowledge base. It doesn't matter. They make you feel like you're drinking the finest red wine in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the coffee reflects that. I mean, it's the amount of flavor that came out of the espresso was like biting into an orange and then having a little bit of milk on top of that, but a perfect balance of the two. Almost like the umami of coffee, if it can actually be described that way.
Mm-hmm. I must say, when I was there, I went to his cafe 3 times in 2 days, my wife and I, and it was really remarkable. Yeah. And there's no food, there's no desserts, no buns or anything like they often have in Sweden. It's purely coffee. And like you say, they're working very seriously in that side room. And Tim has 3 coffee farms of his own in Colombia. And I actually have an interview with him that's posted up here on the blogcast at the Coffee League. And please take the time to listen to it, because he really is a legend in the industry. And I don't think he does many interviews. And I was very fortunate to have gotten one with him. And
yeah.
How many you were there? You said a couple of times, and how long a period were you there?
I think I was actually only there for 3 days, but I must have went to visit the cafe at least 6 times.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
What were some of your? You were in Scandinavia. Then, what were some of your other favorite places?
I love Drop Coffee in Stockholm. After a really long jet-lagged flight, that was the first place that I went, and similar in terms of the flavor profiles to Collective Coffee for me, especially the Kenyan beans that they're roasting. But I think, each region has its own palate, and a lot of it depends on the water, even the minerals in the water. And I think that coffee is special and unique because of where it's made. I don't think, I tried to bring back a bag of beans from Drop Coffee in Stockholm and made them, in San Francisco, and it just wasn't the same. Right. So I think there's something to be said about local origin playing, a part in extraordinary taste.
Right. I was also at Drop Coffee, and I have an interview with the woman who founded and runs Drop Coffee, Joanna Alm. She's a wonderful person, just like Tim. I mean, he's a real expert. She goes into the world roaster competitions, and I think the last 3 years she's finished, 4th, 2nd, and 3rd. So she's very serious about her roasting. I think it's all single origin there. It tends to go with the lighter roast, like many places in Scandinavia, and a real perfectionist. And I think she's starting to bring some of her coffee into the States, and I think that she was going to have some pop-up places. And we'll find out more about that and make that information available. But she was another great interview and lovely person. And then you're living in San Francisco now. What are some of your favorite places there, or other spots in the U.S. that you've been?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say my go-to place in San Francisco is Four Barrel. It's a great cafe. They serve a lot of drinks. They have a homemade macadamia nut milk that you have to try with your cappuccino. Some other good shops. They have Blue Bottle. I really like Sight Glass is a local roaster out of San Francisco. Very mom and pop shop.
Sight
A
Glass?
lot of
Mm-hmm.
Sight Glass. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and they're almost like a startup for the coffee world. They're very small, privately owned, but they have a lot of deeper notes in their coffee, and not quite as light as Four Barrel, and not quite as subtle. A little more robust. I really like them. And then there's a few other roasters. I'm trying to think of the names. But Intelligentsia, I lived in Chicago for a couple of years. Intelligentsia is, I think, a staple within the coffee industry.
Mm-hmm.
Consistency across the board. I think they're one of the best roasters in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would say Hart out of Portland. Hart and Cova, Coava, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
Cova Roaster. Are doing some really interesting light roasts as well. They have this kind of industrial-like warehouse, and I'm not sure the quadrant of Portland, but really, 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 really well done beans. And so I would say those are my go-tos. But definitely in San Francisco, Four Barrel is the spot.
All right, and you mentioned we had the discussion once off the air about New York. There were a couple of places you mentioned there, and I'm always amazed at all the places you know because wherever I've gone, you've been there before. So
Yeah.
I'm following your trail here. But in New York, you have, and again, I want to say, as I always do, that a lot of it's a matter of taste. There's so many good places now,
Yeah.
so I'm very reluctant to always say, "Hey, this is the best place." But there are places that are consistently appreciated by many, many folks. And I think it's great that you're mentioning and describing your experiences there. What about New York?
New York, I like Stumptown actually has a great presence in New York.
Hmm.
There's a few shops there. Maybe one location. I'm not sure. Madman Espresso,
Hmm.
I believe it's called.
I've been there, yeah.
La Colombe, which started out of Philadelphia,
Right.
has a pretty strong presence there. I really, really like their coffees,
Hmm.
especially the pour overs.
Hmm.
Trying to think what else. There was one more. There was one that you mentioned where they dissect
Oh
the
yeah, I think
latte.
it's called Coffee and Project Coffee, the Coffee Project.
Yeah,
I think it's on
yeah,
the east side on around Fifth Street. And you
yeah,
describe what it was like in there because they actually they'll deconstruct a coffee for you. Explain that.
yeah. So they basically separate the parts of an espresso drink. So you'll receive a shot of espresso. You'll receive a steamed milk, actually, and then I think it's like a little bit of foam, or there's one other component to it. But they actually deconstruct your espresso drink and then serve it to you as a treat.
Yeah.
And it's a small little shop, really narrow, only a couple seats. But also, you know, similar to Four Barrel in their pursuit of perfection is just unprecedented.
Yeah. I want to
So
say
it's
that.
really, really
Yeah.
experimental shop.
Yeah, I was there recently for the first time, and it's one of those places I had to go to a second time, even though I was just there a few days. And the lovely woman runs the place, very knowledgeable. And the reason she deconstructs like that is because she figures somebody who maybe just drinks lattes or I think it's a deconstructed latte or cappuccinos might not try the coffee black, but if she gives you a little bit of the latte, a little bit of the
Right.
espresso separate from it, then you're more likely to try it. Her name is Sum, S-U-M, and
Yeah.
it's a great place, and it's on Fifth Street in the Lower East Side of New York City, and it's called the Coffee Project. That was a really good place. And and you mentioned Stumptown. Yeah, Stumptown. There's a couple in New York. There's one down in the Village, and they just, by the way, Stumptown just, and this is when we're talking now, it's December. 2017. They just opened their first brick and mortar shop in Chicago, and I'll be there next week, and I look forward to going there. And I always, like you, I always go to Intelligentsia, and there's at least
Yeah.
two or more of them there, and where they started. But there's so many good places. And again, sometimes I'll say, "Hey, this place is great," and somebody says, "Well, I think that's good," but there's another place that's even better. And it really comes down to a matter of taste. But there's so many places now where you can go and find good coffee. And really, just 5 or 6 years ago in New York City, we used to go to Ninth Street. There weren't that many really. There weren't that many specialty coffee shops like what we call third wave. That now there, I was at the New York City Coffee Festival in October, and we went. My wife and I went to probably 30, 40 places in New York during the 2 week period that we were there, and didn't cover it all. And then Brooklyn is another spot, and a lot of the roasters are in Brooklyn and Long Island City now because the real estate's very expensive to set up in in the Manhattan. Do you find your taste changes over time, even now that you maybe have a few single origin beans that you really like? Um, do you find that you experiment still a lot, and does it change?
Yeah, yeah. So um, I think my flavor profile, taste profile has changed significantly. I only used to drink lighter roasts, more not lighter roasts, but lighter flavor profiles like Ethiopians and Kenyans and more
Hmm.
zesty kind of coffees. But recently, I've been getting into darker like currants and almost like raisins and caramels and that will come out of Nicaraguan or
Hmm.
Guatemalan or even Colombian beans. And I think that has to do with seasonality. I think in the winter you want something that's a little more robust and thicker and has
Hmm.
a cozier feeling to it. And in summer, when it's bright out and sunny, you want something that's more like a Kenyan, that's lighter and juicier. And so I think it changes with the seasons a lot. But I'm trying to experiment with more of the Nicaraguan and Guatemalan beans. And my parents have a subscription to Four Barrels that they get sent to Iowa, and I've been trying some of the beans that they've been sent recently, and their darker profiles, and it's been really nice to have
Hmm.
that during the winter months.
And I'm
So
always curious. I'm always curious as to what people's uh, coffee consumption habits are. Do you go to a cafe every day? Do you make it at home? If you make it at home, how do you make it?
when I'm in San Francisco, I love to get out of the house and go to a cafe. Um, so I'll start my morning by going to sight glass, going into work, and then usually the places that I've worked have their own pour over machine, so I'll have another cup in the afternoon. I've had 2 cups a day all the way up to 4 or 5 cups a day. So
Hmm.
I'm trying to cut back a little bit, but usually like 1.5 to 2 cups a day is what I'm on.
And when you drink it at home, do you use a Chemex?
Yeah, for myself, I like the V60 just because it's quick. It's about 2.5 minutes. Chemex can be a little bit longer, even though it's it's very similar. I think it's a little bit more of a cleaner
Hmm.
cup. I like a little bit more grit, which is the V60 or like a beehive.
Hmm.
And it's really simple. You just need a glass
Right.
and
And let me, I'm
half that.
curious, when you make if you make a cup of coffee just for yourself and you use, say, a Chemex, how many grams of coffee do you use? How many grams and what of water do
Yeah,
you use? Huh?
usually I use 21 grams of
Hmm.
coffee, and I'll use about 360 grams of water.
Okay.
And I'll just measure that out, and then that should pour over the course of 3 minutes and 15 seconds.
Right.
It
And
should be
that's
done.
usually
Uh,
the ratio is usually anywhere from 10 to 15 to 1, 14 to 1, something like that,
yeah.
even 16 to 1. So that sounds so yeah, for people out there and you're listening, if you want to try a nice pour over, there's a Chemex, the V60. It's not a pour over, but the AeroPress is very easy to use. So you don't have to invest a lot of money to have good coffee at home. You don't have to go out and buy an expensive espresso machine. One other thing that I wanted to ask you, Adam, uh,
Yeah.
that I'm curious about, and one of the things I want to really explore. in this blogcast, the Coffee League, is that of coffee culture. You've traveled a lot. You've been to a lot of places. You've been to Europe, a few places in the States. Do you notice the culture within the cafes being different from place to place, and what are some of the differences, if any, that you've noticed?
Yeah. So I think in Scandinavia, there was an emphasis on hospitality and really taking time with each customer. And I'm not saying that that doesn't exist in the States, but I think it's a much more quick on-the-go model that's been created. And even though it's better coffee, I think it's come from a busy lifestyle that Starbucks was originally catering to, or Peet's was originally catering to. In Paris, I noticed the same thing, that each individual cup is prepared slower, and more attention is given to that customer. So it could just be a cultural difference. But I think, in San Francisco, everyone's moving so quickly and has to get to work, and there's just more of a rush to get in and out. Even though the coffee is just as good, it's just a different rapport that happens between the customer and the barista. Except for in Portland, I think Portland's a little bit more slower pace of a community, and there I found that the barista would really take their time and talk to you about the flavor profile that you're about to drink and your interest in coffee. And so it really depends cafe to cafe. But overall in Europe, I felt there was just a slower paced environment.
Yeah, I'm also curious, Adam, about Paris. What was the coffee like there? Do they stick like Italy? They're not so experimental. It's they do things the same way. They're not as affected by third wave coffee and changes in the industry and in how coffee is served and the type of beans they use. What was Paris like?
Paris was warm, friendly. I think there wasn't any particular roaster that I can remember going to, but I went to one shop near the canals up north, the Canal Saint Martin, and it's called something Bell's Coffee or something like that. But it was very similar, very similar to Scandinavia, the hospitality. But I didn't actually have too many different varietals of roasters while I was there. I just went to the same shop. But the milk quality was great.
But they do pour over as well as espresso.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also in Europe, there's just no question that the quality of milk is outstanding and organic and pasture raised and everything that it should be. And that can vary in the States as well. I think that's just a matter of our agricultural and farming practices and differences between them. So,
a very important aspect. One final question then, that is, are there some cafes that you've heard of that you haven't been to that you would like to go to?
That's a really, really good question. No. Name a few. I actually don't know.
Yeah, well, what we do is, I've done a lot of research, and my wife has done a tremendous amount of research. So we look up a number of places before we go, and then we'll go there. I mean, for instance, I just went to Austin, Texas. I hadn't been there for a while. And it's a bigger city than I thought, and it's a fabulous city. But I went to a place called Fleet, another place called Figure Eight, and another place called Houndstooth, and they were all fabulous. And the baristas were extremely knowledgeable, and it was really cutting edge. And I'm leaving out many others. And again, forgive me if you live there and you know a place that you feel is even better. So I know they're popping up all the time. But if you want to get good coffee now, almost any city, and a lot of smaller cities, they're popping up, and the quality, and I think the customer is becoming more sophisticated, and the demand for good specialty coffee, high quality coffee, is growing. Or most of your amongst your friends, like out in San Francisco, do you consider many of them sophisticated when it comes to their coffee taste? Or do you find that in the last few years, the interest in coffee has gone up significantly amongst people your age?
Yeah, so I think it's easy to drink good coffee in San Francisco, and by default, I think that that's what they drink
Hmm.
because it's more available than more mass consumer shops. So I don't know if they're as obsessed with it as I have been and still am, but I think they drink it because it's there and it's the go-to places. So it's easy.
Great. Well, Adam, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I want to have you back on sometime in a year or so, so we can talk about new places we've experienced. That's one of the fun things about coffee is that anytime you go to a city, you can find you do a little research and find out what's where. And here at the Coffee League, we have recommendations we make for various cities, knowing that we can't cover them all, but we can always give you a few places in any city almost that you can go where you're guaranteed to have a good quality of coffee, and I think that is growing. So again, thanks for your time, Adam.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate
All
it.
right.